You're listening to episode 209 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Justin Merritt joins us to speak about his blog and podcast, Simple Suttas. There are plenty of Dhamma Talk podcasts out in the world, and that's great. It gives a wide set of options of teachers one can listen to about the Buddhasasana. But there aren't a lot of podcasts that focus largely on the suttas themselves. Fortunately, today's guest is providing just that. Justin Merritt is a Theravadan Buddhist and student of Bhante Sati. The focus of his practice and study is early Buddhism and the earliest suttas. He is a board member and teacher at the Northfield Buddhist Meditation Center in Northfield, Minnesota. As a composer, he was the youngest ever winner of the ASCAP Foundation Rudolf Nissim Award. He is also the winner of a host of other awards, including the 2011-12 McKnight Fellowship, the Copeland Award, the Minnesota Orchestra Composer Institute Prize, and the Polyphonos Prize. So sit back, relax, and have a nice cherry Coke. Our guest today is Justin Merritt. Justin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be with you today, Ted.
So let's start by talking a little bit about your background with Buddhism and contemplative practice.
Sure. Well, I was thinking about it, and actually, I have a very boring story. I never spent 10 years in Tibet or any of these fascinating stories that some of your guests do. In a way, I have a very kind of boring American story. Grew up as a Christian, very devout Christian, lost my faith as a teenager and discovered Buddhism, and has just been very swept away. In fact, I was thinking about this, and it occurred to me that I had a very similar path as my father, who also had a change of heart and converted right about the time he was in his late 20s. I did the same thing, and it occurred to me that it's kind of the same story with the Buddha, right? There's something about late 20s, early 30s is the time for at least men to start questioning their faith. I'm sure for a lot of women too, and looking for something a little bit deeper. So that's a lot of my background.
So, Justin, was there anything in particular that brought you to that questioning? Was it just that's what things felt like at the times? Were there any particular circumstances leading to that?
Yeah, again, I think kind of the boring stuff. I had a new son, and I was just looking at things from a different perspective, and finished my education, had a job, and just thought, well, there's got to be more. The other thing, of course, which I think now probably the majority of people in America coming to Buddhism are coming because they feel incredibly stressed out, they feel overwhelmed, and have heard about meditation and think, well, this is something I'll take a stab at and see if it helps. It's a really interesting and historically unique path to get to Buddhism, right? Is this kind of self-help sort of approach to it, which is where I started as well. And I've got to say, I think we do some interesting things with that. There was a story on the podcast the other day about the Buddha's brother. Do you know the story? This is a wonderful story. The Buddha's brother, his half-brother, actually his three-quarters brother, because it was the son of his father and his aunt. Wonderful story where he ordains, becomes a monk, and decides, he's going to follow this path, but then starts having all kinds of trouble, right? Like he can't do it. He can't hack it. And he starts telling the other monks, I think I'm going to quit. I'm going to disrobe. And so they tell the Buddha, and the Buddha, summons him. So he says, what's the problem? And his brother says basically that when he was leaving home, he met this beautiful girl with mussed up hair. And he's been thinking about her ever since. He can't quit thinking about this beautiful girl with the mussed up hair from the village.
I think I met that girl myself. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Well, so the Buddha takes his brother by the arm, and zoom, they go to heaven, right? And there are these beautiful devas, these beautiful angels all over the place, gorgeous. So they take a look around, and then zoom, they come back. And the Buddha says, well, what do you think? And his brother says, oh my gosh, these devas were gorgeous. He says, any one of them makes that girl from the village look like a deformed monkey. They're so beautiful. So he go, and the Buddha says, well, if you practice, you might go to heaven. So his brother starts practicing, meditating, doing all these things. And all the other monks are kind of making fun of him, like, oh, you're not serious. You're not coming to practice for a deep spiritual reason. You're just here for the beautiful, devas in heaven. Lo and behold, so his brother's practicing, he's getting deeper, he's getting, going along the path, and he gets kind of swept away, and his meditation is going great. And he realizes, there's more to it than the devas, more to it than the beautiful women in heaven. And he actually becomes enlightened. And I was thinking about this story with people coming to meditation for stress relief, and thinking, how perfect it was that people can come from all different kinds of weird doors, expecting different things out of spiritual practice. And it really doesn't matter. I mean, most of us don't come with a pure, perfect heart anyway. And how beautiful it is that people want to come to Buddhism because they're stressed out, because they're worried, and that we offer this wonderful teaching that can be of benefit to them. And then on the other hand, they might get way more out of it than they ever expected. So that was certainly the case for me. I started out thinking, well, I'll just meditate. I like the sound of Vipassana. Sounds very scientific. Sounds very clean. I can ignore all these ancient texts, ignore the monks, ignore, all the trappings of that stuff, and I'll just be stress relief, and that's it. And interestingly, on the one hand, it was beneficial, but not nearly as beneficial as it could have been had I been willing to look at other aspects of the path, and had I been taught other aspects of the path when I had that chance. And nevertheless, it was kind of like the gateway drug to other parts of the practice.
Yeah, Justin, you had mentioned that your first introduction was kind of a self-help kind of way. Can you tell a little bit more about that? What was that event? What was that circumstance?
Oh, sure. I should say, the first time I learned about Buddhism was in college, and I was very interested in it, very excited by it. But, I was in Texas, there was no teacher around, and I kind of put it aside. I'd just, recently lost my faith, and I just thought, well, I'm not going to pick up something else, and I was busy with school and whatnot. Then it was really when I moved to Minnesota that I really picked it back up again, and partly because there's so much happening with Buddhism in Minnesota. It's really incredible. I had no idea when we moved here, but there's, we're right next to a giant Cambodian temple and a Lao temple, and there are Zen centers in the city. And then also there was this wonderful little meditation center in Northfield. Literally we were coming into town and I saw a sign that said, this mile of road is being cleaned by the Buddhist youth group. And I thought, well, this is amazing. I've got to check this out.
Welcome to Northfield, Minnesota.
Exactly right. 20,000 people in one Buddhist meditation center. So that was wonderful. And then the other thing was, just new job, new state. I hadn't been married very long, new kid. I was completely stressed out. And, just kind of the vibe of the culture is, hey, you're stressed out, then try meditation. But ironically, the meditation form that I was given to start with is, if anything, like the worst possible meditation form for people with a lot of anxiety. And not that it's, bad in and of itself, but for anxious people, doing straight, dry Vipassana, arising and passing away phenomena, is probably, of all the Buddhist meditation techniques, the worst thing that you could give to an anxiety-ridden person. So I'm still astonished when I look back that I actually even persevered, because it's such a, if anything, it was exacerbating the anxiety. It was just that when I picked it up, it was such a beautiful little gem that I wasn't going to put it down, even if it was really difficult.
Yeah, I think for many of us, there's a difficulty when we start that it's our first real look at what's going on in our thoughts, for example, and we actually see some increase in our difficulties and our stresses, but we persevere and get through that. What was it for you? What made you stick with it, even though things were maybe not going so well in the beginning?
Well, part of it was, for me, the second you sit down, and like you said, you start really looking at your mind, you realize, oh my gosh, there's this incredible depth there that I never understood before, that I never experienced, and I was just completely fascinated with it. And so I kept plugging away. The other thing is that I had the fortune of meeting some wonderful teachers here. I mean, there's just some wonderful practitioners who supported me. Also online, one of the things that really got me going was actually podcasts, which is something I'm so delighted to be able to be a part of that on yours and on my own, because it's this unbelievable tool for getting the Dhamma out to people that wouldn't otherwise have access. So, listening to podcasts like the Gil Fronsdal podcast were really what got me going. Such a great resource for newbies.
So let's shift a little bit. The reason we're here to talk is about your own podcast. Before we go into what it is and kind of the content there and why you're doing it, how did that start? What made you decide to put out your own podcast?
A big part of it was just love of the suttas. I mean, one of the really transformative things that happened in my practice was coming to these ancient teachings and just hearing a completely different perspective on practice. So challenging, so interesting, and just feeling like everything was transformed when I got my hands on those. But on the other side, it's almost impossible for someone with no Buddhist experience to sit down to the suttas, read, and get much out of it. So I started out like most people. I would read things by wonderful teachers explaining the suttas. But when I first tried to do it myself, I bought the Bhikkhu Bodhi Samyutta Nikaya, right, this giant, collection. And exactly right. And I sat down to read, and it's like 200 pages of the Buddha reciting poetry to angels. And I just thought, this is really difficult. And there's these strange terms, and you don't know where to get into it exactly. So the mission of my blog, the mission of the podcast, is to take suttas and curate the really interesting ones, the really weird ones, the really inspiring ones, and then to do translations of them and explanations of them that are straightforward, that anybody, almost could sit down and get something from that text. So simple suttas, the idea is a simple way of putting forward the suttas.
So as you're doing this, tell us about the format itself. Do you read the sutta and then talk about it, or what's the structure of the podcast?
It's all over the place. The podcasts are often just audio versions of the blog. So, you can get it in different methods. And they vary. So sometimes it's just literally a reading of the translation. Sometimes I have more of a commentary. And sometimes, frankly, I'm just a very opinionated guy, and I have things to say about the Dhamma. And so some of it's just a straight kind of opinion on that matter. So you get a little bit of everything.
So what were some of the most inspiring things for you that you've run across as you've been doing the podcast?
I think the biggest one is something you mentioned earlier, which is the power of stories. This is something I've come to from like multiple different places now. So I'm also a professor. I teach music composition at St. Olaf College. And just in my teaching, I've noticed how incredibly powerful stories are. They stick in the memory. They have this power that just stating something doesn't. Right? Same for my kids. I have two beautiful, kids, and I love to tell them stories. And the power of stories with them is remarkable. They will remember a story for, years, all kinds of crazy details that they wouldn't if I just told them something. And the suttas are just full of these wonderful, weird, interesting stories. And the mythological power of these stories is really potent. And something that struck me is how you can take a lot of the more sophisticated stories and hear them in different ways at different times in your life, and they strike you differently. The best stories are the ones where there's no easy analysis of it. Instead, you just keep coming back over and over and over and seeing it in different ways, understanding it in different ways. To take a simple one, right? One of the series I've been doing this summer is a collection from the Therigatha, these stories of the nuns, the first couple of generations of Buddhist nuns. And there's this story. There's a nun, she's meditating in the forest, and a little demon, Mara, comes out to her and kind of whispers in her ear, says, what are you doing? You couldn't get enlightened. You're just a woman. But he doesn't know what he's up against, because this is like a really, enlightened nun. And she says, I know you, Mara. And immediately his head hangs down, his shoulders slump, and he slinks off into the forest. Right? So on the one hand, it's a story, and it's like this really memorable story. You have this image, red-skinned demon with horns, with his shoulders slumped, like, oh, darn it, walking off into the woods. Such a perfect image. But then there's also kind of this story with it, right? And if you just took it at face value, this is how you deal with a demon in the woods, it's not very useful, right? How often does that come up? Not very, not very often. But if you take it instead as this is how you deal with doubt, then it's actually really very powerful, right? So how do you deal with doubt? By recognizing it. And once you recognize doubt, then most of the power of doubt is lost. And I think hearing it as a story is going to be vastly more, make a vastly bigger impression than hearing it as just a doctrine, just as a teaching. Don't let doubt overwhelm your practice, something like that. Instead, it's at that moment, that key moment where doubt is coming. If that image of that demon, slinking off into the forest comes to you, that's going to be way more powerful, way more useful. And that's only, the very simplest story. I've been thinking a lot recently about the ideology behind the biography of the Buddha we have, and how different versions of the story give us a different message about how we're supposed to practice. Do you mind?
No, please. I think this is a great area of conversation, because on the one hand, we have, the Buddha as a human being, as just a very well-realized, aware person who went, oh, yeah, and formulated a systemized way for people to awaken, to become more aware. And then on the other hand, we have the glowing guy who's always emitting an aura, who is this supernatural creature who poofs into different realms. So yeah, I think it's a very good thing for us to talk about.
Yeah, I love the way you put it, because in a lot of ways, every different story about the Buddha has a lot of the same details, right? He's born, he's into a wealthy family, he's spoiled a little bit. He finally goes out on his own. He's having this spiritual realization. He goes forth. He becomes a monk. He studies. He has these teachers. But eventually, he has to go past all of it, right? So he has to leave his family. He has to leave his teachers. He has to leave his friends. He has to leave everything he's ever learned and totally devote himself to practice, right? And it's only then that he's able to kind of have this amazing breakthrough. Right. But like you said, there's different versions of the story, right? So there's what I just said is basically the traditional Theravadan version of the story. So the moral, if you will, kind of the ideology behind it is that you have to be willing to sacrifice everything if you're going to really approach liberation. But there's another version of the story too, right? So the later version of the story, still kind of the traditional later version of the story, was that the Buddha was reborn over and over. Now, it was in the Theravadan version too, but in the Theravadan version, sometimes he was this great guy when he was reborn, wonderful minister to the king. And sometimes he was a total jerk. I mean, there was one rebirth where he was a wrestler and he broke this other wrestler's back, but basically lifetime after lifetime not achieving liberation. Right? Well, there's this other version of the story too, kind of this later version, where actually it was lifetime after lifetime he was developing himself. He was getting closer and closer and closer to perfection. So they actually end up having completely different morals, right? So in the traditional Theravadan version, the moral is anybody can approach liberation. You just have to be willing to commit yourself totally. In the later version of the story, it's almost the opposite. More like you can't hope to achieve liberation. Instead, what you should be working for is every day, day by day, working to perfect yourself in the hope that someday, far in the distance, you'll achieve liberation. And then I think the version that you just mentioned is one that I see kind of emerging over the last few decades, kind of the secular Buddhist version of this story, which is to, again, take a lot of the same surface details, right? Going forth, studying, learning meditation, trying austerities, they don't work. But instead, first of all, stripping away all of the different rebirths, any of the past lives, any of that kind of thing. And also reducing the majesty and the power of liberation to being something more along the lines of a human being who's learned to go beyond stress and suffering. And they're really very interesting. They all have different details, even inside the same narrative. And they all have completely different messages about how we should be practicing and what we should be doing. So these stories are really powerful, whether you think they're real or not. I mean, even if you think that they're all just myths, they still have a lot of power. In fact, I saw a study over the summer. They hooked up people to, a bunch of brain wave meters. Where I don't know. I don't remember the details of the story. But basically, they were measuring people's emotional impact for stories that they thought were fictional and stories that they thought were true stories. And the takeaway was that the emotional impact was essentially the same. So these stories work on us in a certain way, whether we take them as being essentially true stories or essentially fables that are supposed to guide us in practice.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that the way we engage with narrative, with myth, doesn't have to be on a level of accepting it as a literal truth. It can be simply something that is an indication, a symbol for our daily experiences, like, as you described before, doubt. We don't have to mean, oh, there is a physical demon who showed up and this is how they did it. It can simply be a way for us to learn about ourselves. And that's riddled throughout the suttas, and sometimes that's taken in a very literal fashion, and sometimes not. But there's still something to learn by them, and that there is myth around them doesn't mean that there's not some gem of useful, pragmatic teaching in them.
Absolutely. In fact, I would say that the myth is the most useful part many times. I mean, there's some suttas that are just straight up doctrine, straight up philosophy, also wonderful, beautiful, useful. But I think the things that stick in most people's heart are the myths. And it is very interesting what you're saying about whether or not you believe it or not. And I think in a way, this is actually perhaps new in the world, to have a large number of people striving diligently, practicing a religion that they don't actually accept the foundational texts as being literally true. I think this has happened throughout the ages, but maybe not in great numbers. It will be interesting to see going forward how that develops.
There are increasingly secularized versions of different faiths. There is an entire organization for secular Judaism. There is, of course, for secular Buddhism and secular Christianity as well. I have not seen such a thing in Islam.
Yeah, that's something I simply don't know. It wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, I think actually the roots of secular Buddhism go back, to the 1860s. I mean, it's anyone that's approaching any kind of religion with a modernist perspective has got to find some way to deal with these things. And you're absolutely right. I grew up as a Christian, and denominations are different. But where I grew up, it was very common to kind of question and think and wonder. And one way to kind of consider it would be like a placebo. And there is an idea that placebos can actually work even if you know they're a placebo, which sort of boggles my mind. So if you believe that the suttas are not necessarily true, you might be able to get all the benefit from them regardless, just by taking them on as a serious part of your practice. I personally think about beliefs a lot, and I've changed a lot in my personal approach to belief and these things. I don't think it's a small thing to toss aside. Nevertheless, I don't think any kind of person growing up in the modern age can swallow the text whole without very serious and rightful questioning.
When we talk about placebo effects, we often consider the idea that, but they really work. And the thing we always need to moderate ourselves on there a bit is that they don't actually work. They do not heal tissue. We need to be careful about that. It doesn't matter how much I believe someone waving their hands over me, channeling cosmic forces will heal my cancer. It won't. I will still die of cancer. And the people who don't survive that are not around to tell us that. What it will do, and this is part of placebo effects, which are measurable, there is stuff happening in the brain, that we can see these in scans, is that I do feel better. And there is a stress component to that which is addressed. And there are cascading placebo effects within certain modalities, but if we just need to be careful about placebo, I believe it, therefore it works. I'm like, well, no, your bone is still broken, whether or not you believe something healed it or not.
Absolutely. And of course, it's just a metaphor. I mean, in talking about the teaching as a placebo isn't saying that it is a placebo. Rather, it's just drawing a comparison between two different kinds of practice there. I think the metaphor there is just that you're having two different kinds of stimulus that are working on you in a different way. And you're absolutely right about the effect being more about stress than anything else. But the truth is, we don't know the exact mechanism for it. And there's no reason to say that resolving stress doesn't have a profound physical effect.
So as you've been doing the podcast, Justin, is there anything that you've run across that were aha moments for you? Or What were some of your favorites?
Absolutely. Well, one of the big ones for me, and there have been several different areas that I've kind of gotten on. One is on health and having to do with food and things like that, and just these kind of weird practical little teachings. I mean, there's a sutta about, where the Buddha says, 5 reasons you should brush your teeth, right? Or 5 good reasons to eat porridge. He teaches about how to lose weight, these kinds of strange things. But the ones that really got to me the most are when I would kind of dig into a sutta that I thought I understood, that I thought I knew. And in trying to explain it, came to these completely different conclusions, or, relatively different conclusions. So, for example, Anapanasati Sutta, right? The very foundational text everybody kind of comes across if you're going to look at any sutta at all. When I first approached it, what I was interested in, what stuck out at me, what really struck me was that last tetrad, the so-called Vipassana tetrad, all about arising and passing away. And I think it was because, I was a newbie. And I was, people that are new at something are always interested in the results, right? You want to get right in and how do I do something and have these amazing results? But in my practice, what ended up happening mostly was frustration, right? It was almost like I was trying to do pole vault and just walking up to the crossbar and jumping as high as I could and getting nowhere because I was aiming for the results instead of aiming at practice. So then, a second time, when I went back and looked at it again, I was more interested in the middle 2 tetrads because I perceived them to be referring to jhana, which, is this amazing teaching that was almost completely left out of practice in the West in the 70s and 80s in a lot of places. And over the last 10 or 15 years has become, increasingly important. And I should say, anytime I talk about jhana, those are the most popular posts on the blog, on the podcast. And people are really hungry for that. But then, I looked at it this summer and found, that I was drawn to the first tetrad, and the most basic one, the one that everybody thinks that they know. And I was completely drawn to it because I feel like it's so easy to skip over. Breathing in, we're mindful. Breathing out, we're mindful. Breathing in long, we're mindful. Breathing in short, we're mindful. And then experiencing the whole body, I breathe in. Experiencing the whole body, I breathe out. And I realized I had always looked at other people's interpretations of this phrase, and you get a whole bunch of different interpretations for it. There's the commentarial interpretation that means you're supposed to be, concentrating on the tip of your nose, right? I read another very earnest teacher saying that actually the mouth is okay, right? You can do the mouth, especially if you have a cold. Other teachers say, actually, it means whole body, but you're supposed to follow your breath wherever it goes. You follow your toes, you follow your fingertips, you follow it wherever. That's what it means by whole body. But all it says is whole body, right? And the very next phrase is essentially breathing in, I relax. Breathing out, I relax. And I think this is one of the key things that we miss, especially when people first come to meditation. I think we've become so concerned with getting away from any kind of new age concept of sitting and relaxing that we're actually skipping over one of the most crucial elements of the practice, is this idea of getting in the right mind state to be doing mindfulness. I think mindfulness in this weird way has become strangely overrated in the popular culture and in Buddhism itself. Not because it's not great, not because it's not wonderful, but because it's only at its most powerful when you have this foundation. And the foundation that's missing is right effort. This is the one that, everybody skips. Nobody wants to hear about when you're doing the Eightfold Path because it sounds terrible, or people just misinterpret it. I've heard people give Dhamma talks and say, right effort. Oh, that means that you try really hard or something like that. Or that you work really hard at your mindfulness,
Yeah, completely missing what the intentionality is of right effort.
Exactly, right. So I've actually stopped translating right effort as right effort, even though that's literally what it means, because it's so misleading, right? Because, of course, the question is right effort to do what? And if you take it to be right effort only to do mindfulness, then you're missing this whole step that comes prior. So you can do mindfulness anytime. You can do mindfulness in any situation. Like I was talking about at the beginning, if you're just stressed out and sit down and try to do mindfulness, it'll help some. But it's vastly better to have a basis of calm, a basis of peace, a basis of just like simple relaxation. And this is the step that's most often missed. So I was absolutely struck by the entire first tetrad of Anapanasati Sutta being all about getting your mind in the right place and getting your body in the right place, to be relaxed enough to actually even come to mindfulness. I think if a person meditated for an hour and spent that, most of that time just trying to relax before even coming to mindfulness, that would be of huge benefit, especially to people that are coming to meditation because they're stressed out. But I think we're scared to give that teaching in a certain way because mindfulness has come to define Buddhism in the popular imagination. I think we've kind of hit peak mindfulness. People, there's articles everywhere about, mindfulness to lose weight, mindfulness to overcome your depression, all these things. And they're true. But people have started to overstate the case so much that people think that the entire path is just mindfulness. Every step of the Eightfold Path is mindfulness, right? It's not just right speech. It has to be mindfulness of speech. It has to be, mindfulness of view, right? That's fine. That's true. But you're missing the whole juice of what comes before. I mean, the suttas are totally clear that each step on the Eightfold Path is based on what came before. So what does everybody say when they try to meditate? They say, oh, I can't meditate because my mind is wandering, right? Or my knee is hurting or whatever. I'm distracted. And it's because they've not taken on board this previous step, this step of deep relaxation, as dunderheaded as it sounds. I mean, nobody sounds smart saying, sit down and relax, right? That's just such a stupid sounding thing to say. But it's so valuable, so important. So this for me, when you're a teacher, you know how important it is to always come back to the basics. Everybody always wants to leap ahead. And every teacher, my wife teaches Chinese, and she spends way longer than anyone else teaching the absolute fundamental basics, tone and pronunciation. And their students, sometimes get frustrated, hey, we want to be ordering from a menu. We want to be talking to our friends. No. You develop bad habits. You go the wrong direction, and you're going to have a way better experience spending most of your time developing those fundamentals before moving on to the advanced practices. So that's been one of the biggest revelations.
I think you raise a very good point that it is important to start your formal meditation practice with setting your intention and allowing yourself to be in that present moment and not try to let go of thoughts. That effort is just going to make it worse. It's very helpful, and this is one of the things that for me I encourage people to develop a relationship with a teacher because they can help you with this understanding to get you going in the right direction, because meditation isn't about stopping thinking, and it isn't about shutting off your life. It's about engaging with it and doing that in a skillful way such that there is progress towards that attenuation or extinguishing of suffering. That's really what it's all about.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And at every step along the path, sometimes you'll have people that say, well, okay, they're willing to accept a lot more suffering than they really need to, even at earlier stages from the path. I think the path, understood correctly, should be of benefit towards suffering every day at every stage. I mean, not to say that you won't have a bad meditation, but I think, one of the lessons I learned is that if you're suffering in your meditation, something is wrong. I mean, long-term, something is wrong. Buddhist meditation doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be kind of an additional suffering. Instead, it really can be a place of peace.
So, Justin, what else did you want us to chat about for a few minutes?
Yeah, I did have one thing I wanted to say, and it's just like a getting up on my soapbox kind of deal, but it's been something I've been thinking about a lot, and I think it's a challenge for us all. There's a lot of energy around Buddhism right now. It's so exciting. I'm so pleased with the trajectory that we're going. But I see problems on the horizon, and I see worries on the horizon. And I'm especially worried that Buddhists have this tendency of subdividing into smaller and smaller subsets. And I think it's potentially worrisome. The church I grew up in was an offshoot of the Mormon church. So you got this giant Mormon church and then this smaller offshoot, a few 100,000 people worldwide. And in that church, almost every time there was any new doctrinal dispute, there were people splitting off on that. So you'd have a few hundred here, a few hundred there, splitting off. There was this one ridiculous church that had, 30 people that were splitting off and proclaiming themselves to be the one true church of God. And you're just thinking, got 30 people, So the meditation center that I'm involved in, I'm really pleased the way it's kind of evolved is that it's a small town and it's a small center compared to a lot of places, but absolutely everyone is welcome. I mean, people that do more Zen, people that do more secular, people that do more Theravada, insight approaches, everyone is welcome. And we invite teachers from all the different traditions. I think there's something really healthy there. And I've been reading rather about kind of early sects in the first few centuries after the Buddha. It seemed like, on the one hand, there was huge diversity of opinion. I mean, even just a couple of centuries after the Buddha, people were constantly talking and debating about different doctrines, but by and large, they practiced together. So, for example, for centuries and centuries, there was no evidence of Mahayana temples anywhere in India. And this seemed to be like a problem. Like, what does this mean? Does it mean that Mahayana wasn't important? What's the deal? Well, it seems like now that scholarship is tending towards saying that, yeah, there were Mahayana scholars. There just weren't Mahayana temples. That it wasn't a division that happened in that way. It was just different people in the same monastery thinking differently, practicing differently, and they would, perhaps work in smaller groups from time to time. But by and large, they thought of themselves as Buddhists working together. And I'm a bit worried that if we can't kind of get it together in that way, when harder times come, we're going to be in these tiny little fragmented groups and unable to help each other as we should. I mean, Buddhism has had some incredible natural advantages in America that we're not going to have forever, right? So we've had this wonderful spokesperson in the Dalai Lama. I mean, I'm not particularly a follower of the Dalai Lama, but you can just hardly ask for a better spokesperson for a religion. He's just such an incredible personality, right? Well, whenever he goes, hopefully, a long, long time from now, it's going to be ugly, right? There's, the Chinese government's going to be trying to install a new Dalai Lama. There's going to be arguments, and it's probably going to be decades before there's anyone that could replace him. There's been this surge in interest in mindfulness, which already seems to me to be having something of a backlash in the popular culture. That's going to go away, and Buddhism has this kind of halo of being a peaceful religion, which I think it is in its heart. But every time there's a story about, a Sri Lankan Buddhist gang attacking Muslims or in Burma or in Thailand, that glow, gets a little bit dimmer. But perhaps what's going to save us is if we can learn to practice together, learn to be together, and learn to have a huge amount of tolerance for different kinds of opinions, knowing that the heart of Buddhism for all of us is the same, that focus on contemplation, that focus on loving kindness, and that focus on liberation from suffering for us and for everybody else. That needs to be the focus, not these small doctrinal differences.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the importance of having a healthy, diverse population of ideas and practices, as well as people, is what makes us stronger in whatever field of human endeavor it happens to be, not just Buddhism, but in all things. Being able to share that commonality and build these bridges rather than put up walls of ideological distinction. I think you're right.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
Well, our guest today has been Justin Merritt, and you can find out more about his work on simplesuttas.wordpress.com, which, of course, I'll be linking on the episode page for this episode. Justin, thanks for being here.
It was a pleasure. Thanks, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.